People talk about St. Louis like it's finished, like it had its moment, messed it up, and faded into irrelevance. Another American city that couldn't keep up. Another cautionary tale about urban decline. Another punchline for people who've never actually been there. But here's the uncomfortable truth. St. Louis didn't stop defining Missouri when it declined. It started defining Missouri because it declined. The city's trajectory, its rise, its fall, its ongoing struggle for recognition, mirrors patterns that shaped the entire state and, frankly, much of America's industrial heartland. And until you understand St. Louis, you don't understand Missouri, or how America treats cities it no longer knows what to do with. Today, we're breaking down 25 uncomfortable truths about St. Louis that explain why this city still matters, even when the national narrative pretends it doesn't. Let's begin. St. Louis was once one of America's most powerful cities. This part gets glossed over in contemporary discussions. People know St. Louis declined. They rarely understand what it declined from. St. Louis was not just important, it was central to American development. The city controlled river trade on the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. It shaped westward expansion by serving as the launching point for settlers, traders, and explorers heading into unknown territory. It decided who moved, who traded, and who passed through the continental interior. At one point, St. Louis ranked among the 4 largest cities in the United States. Economically powerful, politically influential, and culturally significant in ways that seem impossible to imagine today. This was not an accident. It was geography meeting opportunity at the precise historical moment when rivers determined commerce and location determined destiny. The Gateway Arch wasn't a celebration, it was a eulogy. The Gateway Arch is framed as civic pride. It is presented as St. Louis commemorating its role in westward expansion and celebrating its place in American history. But timing matters. By the time the arch was completed in 1965, St. Louis was already losing population, industry, and economic leverage. The city had peaked and begun its long descent. The monument that was supposed to herald a bright future actually marked the end of an era that would not return. The arch did not launch a future. It memorialized a past. It was a symbol built precisely when momentum was already slipping away, a steel monument to what St. Louis had been, not what it would become. That irony is rarely acknowledged when tourists photograph the skyline. St. Louis didn't collapse. It bled slowly. There was no single disaster that destroyed St. Louis. No earthquake, no hurricane, no sudden catastrophe that explains everything. Just slow erosion, manufacturing leaving for cheaper labor markets, jobs relocating to Sunbelt cities and overseas, suburbs pulling wealth outward beyond city limits, highways enabling escape from urban problems. Slow decline is harder to notice than sudden collapse, and it is easier to blame the people who stayed rather than the systems that failed them. St. Louis didn't fall apart in a moment. It drained over decades, one factory closure at a time, one family departure at a time, one decision at a time. That gradual bleeding does not make good television, so the story never gets told properly. 4. The city was frozen while the metro kept moving. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about St. Louis, and one of the most important. In 1876, the city of St. Louis separated from St. Louis County. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. The city was prosperous and did not want to subsidize rural areas. But that decision froze the city's borders permanently. The metropolitan area kept expanding. Families moved outward into suburbs. Businesses relocated to office parks. The tax base followed wealth beyond city limits. But the city's responsibilities did not shrink. It still had to maintain infrastructure, provide services, and support populations that remained, with a dramatically reduced revenue base. That is not mismanagement. That is structural entrapment created by a 19th century decision that could not anticipate 20th century suburban sprawl. 5. St. Louis became a national punchline to avoid explanation. Explaining what happened to St. Louis requires engaging with uncomfortable topics: deindustrialization, racial segregation, federal highway policy, suburban flight, and regional governance failures. That's complicated. Punchlines are easier, so St. Louis became shorthand for urban failure, a city you reference when you want to signal decline without explaining causation. Don't become St. Louis substitutes for analysis. It's easier to say that city failed than to say that system stopped working for that city. Punchlines replace accountability. They let everyone outside St. Louis feel superior without examining whether the same forces might affect them. St. Louis didn't fail in isolation. It failed the same way dozens of cities failed. It just failed more visibly. 6. Crime became the only story people were allowed to tell. Crime in St. Louis is real. Violence is real. Acknowledging that isn't controversial. But when crime becomes the only lens through which a city is viewed, everything else disappears. The context that created conditions for crime, the history that shaped neighborhoods, the policy decisions that concentrated poverty, and the economic forces that eliminated legitimate opportunity. St. Louis didn't invent violence. It absorbed pressures that other cities exported through zoning, policing, and economic development that pushed problems elsewhere. Crime statistics stripped of context become weapons against cities rather than tools for understanding them. St. Louis gets defined by what went wrong, rarely by why it went wrong or what it takes to make things better. White flight didn't just change the city, it redefined blame. We talk about demographic change in St. Louis using passive language. People say the population shifted, the city changed as if it just happened, like weather. We do not talk as much about decisions. When white families left St. Louis for the suburbs, they took wealth and political power and social capital with them. They left behind communities with fewer resources to maintain institutions, schools, and infrastructure. Then the people who remained were blamed for outcomes they did not engineer. This pattern is not unique to St. Louis, but St. Louis carried it longer, more visibly, and with fewer resources to counter the narrative. The people who stayed were held responsible for conditions created by people who left. Section 8. St. Louis was too important to fail and too complicated to save. Federal attention operates like a spotlight. It focuses on crisis or success. Cities that collapse dramatically attract intervention, and cities that succeed dramatically attract investment. St. Louis lived in the shadow between those categories, not failing loudly enough to demand federal rescue, not succeeding loudly enough to inspire private investment, just declining steadily in ways that did not generate headlines or emergency responses. So it drifted. Too complicated for simple solutions, too sprawling for targeted interventions, too politically fragmented for coordinated action. Cities in the middle do not get rescued. They get ignored while attention flows to either spectacular failure or spectacular success. St. Louis qualified for neither category. Kansas City grew and diversified. Springfield stabilized. Columbia anchored the middle of the state with a university-driven economy. But Missouri never replaced St. Louis as its defining city. It could not. St. Louis still shaped perception. When people outside Missouri think about the state, they are often reacting to St. Louis even if they do not realize it. The city's reputation bleeds into the state's reputation. Its struggles become the state's image problem. Missouri reoriented around St. Louis the way a family reorients around a member in crisis. Other cities developed their own identities, but the central presence, for better or worse, remained the city everyone was either avoiding or defending. 10. St. Louis became a warning instead of a case study. America had a choice in how to understand St. Louis. It could ask, What happened here? What forces created this outcome? What can we learn? Or it could decide, do not become that. America chose the warning. It chose to make St. Louis an object lesson rather than a subject of serious inquiry. Warnings end conversation. They tell you what to avoid without explaining why it happened or whether avoidance is actually possible. Case studies force uncomfortable answers about policy, about investment, about choices that every city makes. St. Louis deserved case study treatment. It got cautionary tale status instead. Mid-video reminder. If you appreciate breakdowns that go deeper than headlines and talking points, subscribe to Hard Truth Untold. This channel exists to explain the stories we stopped finishing, the ones that got too uncomfortable to keep telling honestly. Most channels accept the easy narrative. We do not. Hit subscribe and let us continue. St. Louis didn't lose relevance. It lost narrative control. Cities don't die when money leaves. They don't die when population shrinks. They don't even die when industries relocate. Cities die when they lose the ability to define themselves, when outside narratives completely replace local identity. St. Louis hasn't been allowed to speak for itself in decades. Its story gets told by people who don't live there, don't understand its complexity, and don't have a stake in its accuracy. The city produces artists, entrepreneurs, educators, and community leaders. It generates culture, innovation, and resilience. But those stories struggle to penetrate a national narrative that decided long ago what St. Louis represents. Relevance isn't gone. Narrative control is. 12. The city absorbed regional failure. St. Louis gets blamed for outcomes it did not create alone. Transportation policy at the federal level built highways that enabled suburban flight. Housing decisions at regional levels concentrated poverty within city boundaries. Industrial relocation driven by global economics eliminated manufacturing jobs that once supported middle-class neighborhoods. St. Louis absorbed consequences created far beyond City Hall. It became the repository for problems generated by systems operating at state, regional, and national levels. Blaming the city for regional failure is like blaming a drain for the water that flows into it. The city received what flowed downward and got held responsible for the flood. 13. The decline was interpreted as moral failure. This is the quietest myth, and maybe the most damaging. When cities struggle, people assume values failed. They assume residents made bad choices. Leadership was corrupt. Communities lacked virtue. The decline becomes moralized rather than analyzed. That assumption sticks. It shapes how outsiders view the city, how resources get allocated, how policy gets made. St. Louis did not decline because its people were morally inferior. It declined because structures failed, structures built far from city limits by people who would never face consequences for their decisions. But moral failure narratives are comforting to people outside struggling cities. They suggest decline is earned, not inflicted. That comfort comes at the expense of truth. St. Louis is still functionally important. Here is what does not make headlines. St. Louis still works. Supply chains still run through the region. Major corporations are still headquartered there. Healthcare systems serve multi-state populations. Logistics networks still depend on the city's central position. Labor still flows through systems built decades ago. Functional importance does not look glamorous. It does not photograph well. It does not generate the attention that struggling cities need to shift their narratives. But St. Louis remains structurally important to Missouri and regional economies, even when nobody acknowledges it. The city functions. It produces. It connects. Being ignored is not the same as being irrelevant. 15. The city was asked to compete with its own suburbs. Few cities face this paradox as harshly as St. Louis. The metropolitan area grew. Population increased. Economic activity expanded. But growth happened outside city limits. in suburbs that shared regional benefits without sharing regional responsibilities. St. Louis City was asked to compete for jobs, residents, and investment against those suburbs. Those suburbs could offer lower taxes because they did not carry legacy infrastructure costs, did not serve concentrated poverty populations, and did not maintain systems that benefited the entire region. That competition was not fair. It was structural warfare disguised as market forces. Resentment built on all sides, with city residents feeling abandoned and suburban residents feeling blamed. 16. St. Louis became a stand-in for American anxiety. Decline scares people, especially urban decline. It triggers fears about safety, property values, social order, and the future. So, we project. We make struggling cities into symbols of everything we fear, containers for anxiety that are really about broader trends we cannot control. St. Louis became a symbol of urban decay, of crime, of racial tension, of economic displacement. It absorbed projections from people who needed somewhere to locate their fears. Symbols are not treated gently. They get simplified, exaggerated, and weaponized. St. Louis. The symbol barely resembles St. Louis, the actual city, but the symbol is what most Americans encounter. 17. Missouri's identity fracture runs through St. Louis. Missouri is divided, north versus south, urban versus rural, industrial legacy versus agricultural tradition, progressive urban cores versus conservative rural expanses. St. Louis sits at that intersection. The city absorbs pressures from every direction, representing different things to different Missourians who project their hopes and fears onto it. That's not weakness, that's structural pressure. St. Louis doesn't get to have a simple identity because Missouri doesn't have one. The city becomes the place where state contradictions become visible, which makes it both important and uncomfortable. The city didn't stop trying, it just stopped being heard. The narrative suggests St. Louis gave up, stopped fighting, accepted decline. That's false. Revitalization efforts exist in neighborhoods, business districts, and cultural institutions. Cultural energy exists in music, art, food, and community organizing that rivals any city. Investment exists from residents who chose to stay and fight rather than flee. But narratives lag reality. The story Americans tell about St. Louis is decades old. The city changed while the story stayed frozen. St. Louis didn't stop trying. America stopped listening. Those are different things, but they produce the same result. 19. St. Louis is measured against its peak, not its peers. Every struggling city faces impossible comparisons, but St. Louis faces them more intensely because its peak was so visible. The city does not get compared to peer cities facing similar challenges. It gets compared to itself in 1904, hosting the World's Fair, ranked the fourth largest city in the United States, and serving as a center of national commerce. That is an impossible standard. No city should be measured against its absolute historical peak. Cities rise and fall, fortunes shift, contexts change. But St. Louis is perpetually asked to explain why it is not what it was a century ago, as if that question has an answer that does not indict the entire American economic system. 20. Decline didn't erase influence. It changed its form. St. Louis stopped commanding attention the way it once did. It stopped being a city people looked to for leadership or innovation. But influence didn't disappear. It transformed. St. Louis began cautioning instead of commanding. Its example shaped policy debates, urban planning discussions, and investment decisions in cities that wanted to avoid similar trajectories. That's still influence, just darker influence. The city shapes the national conversation through warning rather than aspiration. People invoke St. Louis when arguing about what not to do. That's not nothing. It's just not what the city deserves. 21. Missouri is judged through St. Louis, fair or not. This is the uncomfortable truth that connects city and state. St. Louis does not just represent itself anymore. It represents what people fear Missouri might become, what they fear the entire heartland might become. When outsiders judge Missouri, they are often reacting to St. Louis stereotypes. The city's image problems become the state's image problems. Its crime statistics become the state's talking points. That is not fair to the city or the state. But fairness is not how perception works. Missouri lives under St. Louis's shadow, and St. Louis lives under its own outdated reputation. St. Louis was built to move America, not to market itself. St. Louis grew powerful because of function, not branding. The city existed to move goods, people, and commerce across the continental interior. That was its purpose. That was its value. Marketing came later, when movement slowed and the city needed new reasons to matter. But cities built for function don't automatically know how to sell themselves. They don't have marketing DNA. They don't naturally generate the kind of self-promotion that attracts attention in an era where attention is currency. St. Louis was built to work, not to advertise. When work wasn't enough, branding never caught up. The city was too honest to repackage its pain. Some cities turn hardship into narrative. They become comeback stories, resilience tales, places that suffered beautifully and emerged transformed. St. Louis never mastered that repackaging. It lived its decline without turning it into an exportable story. The pain was too raw, too ongoing, too complicated to simplify into inspirational content. That honesty, or inability to pretend, cost the city attention that might have helped. America loves redemption stories. It is less interested in stories that are still being written, still painful, still unresolved. St. Louis could not perform a recovery it had not yet achieved. St. Louis didn't fail Missouri. It exposed it. St. Louis is often framed as Missouri's problem, the troubled city that drags down state statistics and reputation. It showed what happens when growth outruns planning, when borders freeze while populations move, when attention goes elsewhere while needs remain, when systems designed for one era can't adapt to another. Everything visible in St. Louis exists in subtler forms across the state. The city just concentrates patterns that rural and suburban Missouri experience differently. St. Louis is Missouri's mirror, and mirrors aren't comfortable. 25. St. Louis still defines Missouri because it forces the question: what happens to cities that built the country when the country moves on? St. Louis does not answer that question. It asks it. Every day, through its continued existence, through its struggles and efforts, through its refusal to disappear despite decades of disinvestment. What do we owe places that served past needs? What happens to populations left behind when economies transform? How do we treat cities that built us when we no longer need what they built? Missouri still lives with those questions. America does too, whether it acknowledges St. Louis or not. If you're from St. Louis, did this feel accurate? Did it capture something you've experienced but rarely heard expressed? If you're not from St. Louis, has this changed how you see the city? Does it make you reconsider assumptions you didn't know you had? Drop your perspective in the comments. Different experiences matter here. The conversation is incomplete without people who actually know the city. The next episode in this Missouri Cities series is already on the channel. It shows the other side of Missouri's story. Subscribe to Hard Truth Untold, because decline doesn't erase importance. It just changes how importance gets measured, and St. Louis still matters, whether anyone admits it or not.